my screen. Everything's taking a little bit longer. Had an update not long ago, but there we are, the Viking Age. So that's our subject. Notice I haven't called it the Vikings. We'll think more about why the Viking Age is more appropriate as we go through. And you can see the first title, The Fury of the Northmen. Well, you would expect no less, wouldn't you? But before we look at the Norsemen and why they might have been furious, let's have a look at the schedule. And just a reminder, the PowerPoints are going to be put up onto the website as PDFs soon as we can, once we've finished. So you'll be able to download this and check it week to week. We're not taking an absolutely chronological approach because the Viking world is so vast that we need to share it out a little bit. We need to look at different zones and different activities. So there's certainly going to be in the middle some time overlap. So explain that from the start. But we're going to start with where the Vikings came from. We'll find out a little bit about the word Viking as well, although beware, we're not going to be able to come up with anything absolutely definitive on that old chestnut. And then we're going to go through the different areas of Viking activity throughout predominantly the 9th and the 10th centuries AD. So we're going to have a look at what used to be a familiar story next week. The invasion of England, the great army of 865, and, well, eventually Alfred the Great and all the rest of it. I say used to be well known. I have no idea whether they teach that in schools today or not. But once upon a time, we all knew those stories. So we start in England, but we're soon moving out. And next time, after that, we're going to be looking at Ireland, Scotland, and the Isles. So for whoever's going up to Orkney, that will be a very appropriate session to meet you on your return. And we're then going to move out across the North Sea and the Baltic as well and have a look at Scandinavia. There's occasionally a danger when looking at the Vikings that we spent so much time looking at where they went to outside Scandinavia, we forget that there's an awful lot going on in Scandinavia as well. And I've called week 4 Dark Age Emporia because we're going to be looking at some very special towns and cities in Scandinavia and along the Baltic coast and even in the Baltic Islands as well. And they, in many ways, are going to act as an explanation for why the Viking phenomenon actually exists in the first place. Midway, we'll have a little bit look at the culture via the wonderful artifacts that the Vikings create. Those of you who've checked in on our new YouTube channel will know that we've been doing a bit of a collaboration with a local glassmaker in the last few weeks who's actually been making Viking-style beads. And so here's a heads up. We've got a nice 40-minute interview with her in which we talk about the different processes which the Vikings might have used when they were working glass. One of the many things that they're very, very expert at, that and metal work, etc. We get a real feel when we look at these towns of the Viking Age, why so many people are sailing around stealing things off people. We sometimes call this the Dark Ages still, and that suggests that nothing much is happening, whereas in fact the exact opposite is true. Up in the north, business is booming. You don't get pirates when there's nothing to steal. So we'll explore that over weeks 4 and 5. And then we'll cast our net wider. We'll go to the fringes of the Viking world, looking at the colonization of Iceland and Greenland, and of course that famous voyage across to North America as well. And also follow the rivers down into Russia and Ukraine. Some of you who've done the history of Russia with me, bits of that will be familiar, but we will reintroduce the Rus, or before that, the Varangians, as they were known, when we look at their work in the Russian rivers, all the way down, in fact, to the Volga and the Caspian Sea, where Vikings meet Arab traders who've come all the way over from the Caliphate of Baghdad. Remarkable stuff. Week 7, we're going to look at a particular Viking city, and well, for some, it's very familiar territory. For those who are close to where I am here in Bishopthorpe, just outside York. For others, well, you'll certainly have heard of it, because of course York's been trading on this since at least the 1970s. Jorvik, the Viking name for York. And have a little look at just exactly what was found at Jorvik and what it tells us about a Viking emporium, a Viking trading and manufacturing centre, predominantly in the 10th century. We'll move on a little bit in time, though, in our final 3 weeks. We're definitely moving from that early period of raiding and settlement and exploration into one in which Scandinavia itself has changed greatly. When the Viking raids begin, there are dozens and dozens of little kingdoms and petty chiefdoms all over what we call the Scandinavian countries today. But as we get towards the end of the 10th century, that changes, and we start to see the emergence of consolidated kingdoms in what is today Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And they also like going a Viking, except they do it with a bigger budget and more men by the time we get into this period. Has a huge impact on England, as we will see in week 9. It's a run-up really to the Norman conquest, though nobody, of course, knew that at the time. And we're going to end with the ending of the Viking Age, really, and one of the cultural artifacts, which we might say is of the Viking Age, which I didn't know how exactly and when to deal with, because I think you've all heard of the sagas. And so many of those sagas deal with the stories of the Viking Age, but they were not written in the Viking Age. They were written afterwards, in some cases long afterwards. So we're going to tell some of those stories, but we're also going to ask the question, how do we deal with a cultural, a literary legacy like this? Some in Scandinavia today want to treat it as literal history. Other people think there's no historical value in whatsoever. The truth's probably going to lie somewhere in between. So we'll have a little look at that element, which in some ways is the swan song of the Viking Age as we finish in week 10. And don't worry, there'll be lots of other little digressions and detours as we go along. I hope that meets your expectations and is more or less what you're expecting when you signed up. And we can also talk about reading for those who want to read along as well. I'll have suggestions and tips as we go through the weeks. But let's make a start. We said this one's going to be about Viking origins. Let's have a think about this business of the Vikings. Who are they? And what does this name actually mean? I thought I'd start by showing you this. It's a picture stone, and it comes from the Baltic island of Gotland. And Gotland is off the eastern coast of Sweden. So it's out in the middle of the Baltic Sea. And this is an area of very, very heavy Viking activity. You could say you're right in the hub of the Viking world on Gotland. It is full of wonderful artifacts, full of coin hoards and treasure. And one of its great towns, the towns of Visby, is one of the great emporia of the Viking Age as well. It's also renowned for these stones. And they are made, carved, should I say, over a long period of time. They're very difficult to date, but some of the earliest picture stones, and this may well be one of them, actually date to before the period when the Vikings are first recorded abroad, before the dates of the first known and recorded attacks. They're generally seen as being 7th or possibly early 8th century. So this is before they're really getting going. And what's remarkable, really, are the things depicted therein. Evidence of a warrior culture in which swords and other weaponry feature very largely. Swords very well made of iron. Evidence of a rich mythology, which will later become more familiar as it spreads to more parts of the Viking world. But the thing that doubtless must be attracting your attention is the Viking ship beneath. We don't know precisely when it happened, but this region, which has a tradition of sailing going right the way back to the Bronze Age, suddenly went into overdrive just before the beginning of the Viking period. We don't know precisely when it happened, but we know that these people had been very good at shipbuilding for hundreds of years, if not millennia. If you think about it, all the fjords, the little islands, the inlets around the coastline of Scandinavia, all its constituent parts, really spoke to a culture that would live by the sea. So we're going to look in a moment at some boats which are very, very old. that are the forerunners, really, of the great Viking longships and trading gnars of the 8th and 9th centuries. But there was one difference about those early ships and the early renditions of them in art. They were powered by rowers, they didn't have sails. And yet at some point, either side we think of about the year 700, it might be earlier, all of a sudden we get depictions of boats with a main central mast and a sail. And that means that a seagoing tradition that was once river-based and coastal, all of a sudden can cast its sights much further afield, proper seagoing vessels. And we get the first clue to this about to happen on these stones on Gotland and other parts, particularly of southern Scandinavia as well.